We have used the Baltimore port for a long time. It's the biggest port for us.
Imagine the images that have been seen around the world. Hundreds of engineers and specialists from South Korea who arrived in the US to build a state-of-the-art battery factory suddenly find themselves in handcuffs. Armed agents, helicopters, armored vehicles, it all looks more like a scene from an action movie than an episode of economic cooperation. But this actually happened in the US state of Georgia, where Hyundai and LG invested billions of dollars in one of their largest joint projects with the US. What was supposed to be a symbol of trust and technological partnership turned into a scandal and a diplomatic crisis. Protests erupted in South Korea, and calls to review relations with Washington appeared on social media. For an ally that had already promised hundreds of billions of dollars in investments in the US economy, this came as a cold shower.
And we are quickly shifting alternative route so that we can work very hard to finding trucks and route.
Against the backdrop of this story, the White House demonstrated toughness and determination to protect the domestic market. New tariffs of up to 100% on key goods were presented as a guarantee of bringing jobs and manufacturing back to the US. But in the end, it was these steps that triggered a chain reaction, the consequences of which were the opposite of what was intended. Instead of strengthening the economy, protectionist policies began to alienate investors and allies. One of the first high-profile examples was Ford. Even before the new tariffs were introduced, it decided to move the production of its iconic pickup trucks to Canada. And when the tariff wars hit the metallurgical and automotive industries, this move turned into a strategic advantage. Canada gained thousands of jobs and billions in investment, while factories in the US faced rising costs and the threat of layoffs.
And the battery is about to arrive at a nearby port, so I don't expect a big impact right now.
But the consequences were not limited to the auto industry. Where Washington hoped to strengthen its position, its closest neighbor began to forge new alliances. Canada announced the largest defense purchase in its history, and the finalists included Germany and South Korea, but not the US. At the same time, Ottawa is actively concluding agreements on the supply of critical minerals and energy resources to Europe, strengthening its influence against the backdrop of US tariffs. The situation is further complicated by the fact that the US energy system is under pressure. Rising consumption and the explosive growth of artificial intelligence and electric vehicles require more and more energy, but tariffs have made infrastructure construction more expensive, and consumer prices are rising faster than inflation. At this point, Canada is becoming a key supplier of oil, gas, uranium, and electricity to the American economy. While strategic battles are unfolding on the diplomatic and energy fronts, events in everyday life vividly reflect the new reality. In Quebec, entire warehouses of American wine and whiskey were taken off the market in response to Washington's tariffs. Some of the products were even prepared for destruction. American producers are losing hundreds of millions of dollars, while local Canadian brands are getting a chance to take over the market.
And our local team has been working closely with the Port of Baltimore and the concerned entity to understand the long-term impact. In the meantime,
this video is about how protectionism and coercion, intended as a tool to strengthen America, are step-by-step leading to the opposite result. We will examine why the raid in Georgia became a symbol of mistrust, how tariffs hit domestic factories, why Canada emerged as the unexpected winner, and what this means for the future of the global economy. In early August, an incident occurred in the US state of Georgia that many in Seoul perceived as a national humiliation. More than 300 South Korean engineers and specialists sent to work at the Hyundai and LG battery under construction found themselves at the center of a large-scale raid by the US Immigration Service. People with official visas were detained as if they were criminals, armored vehicles, helicopters, automatic weapons at the ready, handcuffs on their hands. Workers who had been discussing production drawings just the day before suddenly found themselves in plastic bags for personal belongings, being sent back to Seoul. These images spread across Korean television and social media in a matter of hours, causing shock and anger. For South Korea, where corporate success is closely linked to national pride, the humiliation of high-caliber specialists became more than just a bureaucratic mistake. It was perceived as a demonstration of distrust toward an ally that had invested billions of dollars in the American economy. The American side officially stated that the operation was carried out as part of routine visa compliance checks, but in Korea itself, few people took this version seriously. After all, these were not illegal workers, but specialists invited on official short-term contracts. Moreover, the next day, Hyundai representatives provided evidence that their employees had passed all the necessary checks before arriving in the US. Nevertheless, by the time the explanations were published, hundreds of people were already on planes, and their families were waiting for them in Seoul with tears and protest signs. South Korean news agencies claimed that even during interrogations, the engineers were subjected to abuse. They were not allowed to call the consulate and were refused translations of official documents into Korean. These details were never confirmed by Washington, but public opinion in Korea instantly believed this version of events.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Spontaneous protests took place in Seoul outside the American embassy. Young people waved posters reading "America is not a partner" and "Friendship in handcuffs." Conservative newspapers, which traditionally supported the alliance with the US, wrote about spitting in the face of an ally. Some analysts suggested that there was a deliberate political calculation behind the operation to show that America dictates the rules even to its close partners. In Korean television debates, it was suggested that the raid could be a signal to other countries, primarily Japan and Germany, whose corporations also invest billions in American projects. However, the main issue was not the handcuffs themselves, but their symbolism. The United States wanted to demonstrate its power, but achieved the opposite. It generated mistrust. South Korean investments in the United States were estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars, and it was this money that was supposed to underpin Washington's new industrial strategy. Now, politicians in Seoul were openly asking, is it worth continuing to invest in a country where your specialists are treated as suspect?
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Against this backdrop, the issue of tariffs became more acute. Donald Trump's administration had been strengthening its protectionist course for months. Tariffs of 10, 25, and even 50% became the norm for a whole range of goods, from steel to consumer electronics. And at the height of the crisis, a 100% tariff on semiconductor imports was announced, with the proviso that companies could only get an exemption if they agreed to build new factories in the US. On the one hand, this move looked like a powerful incentive to bring manufacturing back. On the other hand, it made allies dependent on the unpredictable decisions of the White House. South Korean corporations were already feeling the pressure. Behind the scenes in Seoul, there was talk that the rules of the game were becoming increasingly one-sided. Fictitious insider reports circulating in the press claimed that several leaders of leading corporations were discussing the possibility of freezing some projects in the US and redirecting investments to Southeast Asia or even Europe. Although there was no official confirmation, the mere possibility of such a move heightened tensions.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
In Washington, this was perceived differently. There, tariffs were seen as a tool for exerting pressure designed to produce quick results. It was believed that allies would not risk leaving because the American market is too big. But it was the raid in Georgia that showed that it is not only the economy that is at stake, but also national pride. And when a sense of justice is hurt, even multi-billion-dollar contracts can be called into question. The consequences were felt within a few weeks. Several South Korean companies postponed signing contracts to supply equipment to the US, citing market uncertainty. Leaks appeared in the press that the South Korean Ministry of Industry was considering revising the $350 billion investment plan previously promised to Washington. These steps, albeit unofficial, were an alarming signal. Meanwhile, conservative circles in the US presented the raid as a victory. TV presenters assured viewers that America is finally dictating its own rules. But the louder such statements sounded, the deeper the trust among allies fell. Even in Europe, where companies closely monitored tariff policy, people began to wonder, is it worth opening new production facilities in a country where a single political decision is enough to turn engineers into hostages of the situation?
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Thus, the first episode, the raid on the Hyundai and LG factory, became not a local incident, but a kind of symbol of the entire new US policy. It was a moment when economic cooperation collided with political calculation. America wanted to show strength, but showed unpredictability. South Korea wanted to strengthen the alliance, but was given reason to think about the risks. And here the second point, tariff policy, became a natural continuation. In theory, protectionism was supposed to bring jobs and production back to the homeland. In reality, however, it began to turn into a weapon that struck both enemies and allies alike. South Korean and European companies were hit just as hard as Chinese ones. Tariffs on semiconductors, aluminum, and steel increased the cost of projects in the US, making them less attractive.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The goal seemed noble, to revive industry in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. But more and more voices were saying that this path was leading to the opposite result. The cost of building factories in the US was rising, labor was becoming more expensive, and infrastructure was lagging behind. Against this backdrop, allies began to ask a simple question: why invest billions in a country where every new decree turns cooperation into a lottery? Fictitious data circulating in analytical circles claimed that up to 20% of potential investors from South Korea had begun to consider Canada as an alternative location for projects. Conditions there seemed more stable, tariff wars were milder, and the government was more willing to make concessions. Perhaps these figures were exaggerated, but in an atmosphere of mistrust, they seemed quite plausible.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
As a result, the combination of showy raids and aggressive tariffs had the opposite effect to that intended. America wanted to demonstrate toughness and independence, but in reality it began to lose the trust of its partners. South Korean engineers in handcuffs became a symbol of how quickly friendship can turn into humiliation. And tariffs that promised to bring back jobs began to act as barriers, alienating even the closest allies. This is where the main paradox arises. In pursuit of sovereignty, America risked losing what had always been its main trump card: the trust of its allies and the attractiveness of its own market. What began with a raid in Georgia soon turned into a much larger crisis of economic strategy. When Ford announced in early 2024 that it was going to invest $3 billion in modernizing its plant in Oakville, the decision seemed purely market-driven. At that time, demand for electric vehicles was beginning to slow down, while interest in large pickup trucks remained high. It seemed logical to reconfigure the Canadian facility for the production of the legendary Super Duty. At the time, few could have predicted that this decision would become a symbol of the new economic balance of power in North America. But a year later, when Washington's tariff policy became the main tool for putting pressure on its allies, the project in Canada turned from a quiet move into a loud challenge.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
US tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper reached 50%, while duties on auto components rose in the range of 10 to 35%. For factories in Detroit and Ohio, this was a disaster. The cost of assembling a single car increased by almost $5,000. Unions announced impending layoffs, and suppliers warned of the closure of small manufacturing facilities. At the same time, Ford, as if anticipating the crisis, moved the production of thousands of cars to Canada. The conditions there proved to be much more attractive. Cheap energy thanks to hydroelectric power plants, a stable workforce with less risk of strikes, and government support in the form of tax breaks and cheap loans. This situation was bound to cause a political scandal. Donald Trump promised millions of new jobs in American industry, but in reality, thousands of them were moving to neighboring Canada. American television channels quoted economists who claimed that instead of bringing production back, tariffs had become a golden ticket for Ottawa. Fictitious reports from analytical agencies even claimed that the Canadian authorities had secretly lobbied Washington to tighten tariffs, knowing full well that this would push corporations to move production north of the border. Such statements were difficult to confirm, but in the context of the growing crisis, they found fertile ground.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
While workers in Detroit were staging protests at factory gates, new lines were being laid and engineers hired in Oakville. The promised 1,800 jobs was seen as just the beginning. Behind the scenes in the Canadian Parliament, there was talk that by 2030, the total number of jobs related to car manufacturing could increase to 10,000. American commentators called it a betrayal of the industrial homeland, but the companies were acting rationally. Investments go where the conditions are more favorable. The effect of the relocation of production went far beyond the automotive sector. It sent a signal Canada is not just a neighbor, it is ready to take the lead in key industries that America considers its own foundation. This signal coincided with another serious blow to Washington, the largest defense procurement in Ottawa's history. Canada decided to replace its outdated submarines. The project was estimated to cost tens of billions of dollars, and Germany and South Korea were among the contenders. The US, which had been a natural partner in military procurement in previous decades, found itself left out in the cold. For many, this came as a surprise, but the facts spoke for themselves. American shipyards were losing competitiveness due to metal tariffs and rising costs. In addition, Ottawa had already openly stated that if Washington treated Canada as a trade rival, then automatic cooperation in the defense sector could not be expected.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The choice between Germany and South Korea seemed symbolic. Germany offered more expensive but technically advanced submarines, while South Korea offered more affordable ones with faster delivery times. Although a decision had not yet been made, the very fact that the Americans were not allowed to participate in the competition was perceived as a diplomatic slap in the face. Fictitious sources in the Canadian Ministry of Defense allegedly claimed that they had considered the American proposals but concluded that they were inferior in terms of price and delivery times. Even if this detail was an exaggeration, the very fact of the US's exclusion looked like a new level of independence for Ottawa. Against this backdrop, the Canadian Prime Minister actively developed ties with Europe and Asia. Agreements were signed in Berlin on the supply of critical minerals needed for the defense industry. Negotiations on joint energy projects were underway in Warsaw. Even in Latvia, a country that has always looked to the US as its key defender, Ottawa was signing new agreements, emphasizing that Canada had its own agenda. All this was happening at a time when America was increasing tariff pressure. These steps were part of an overall strategy. If Washington closes its doors, Canada will open windows to other regions. European partners saw this as an opportunity to reduce their dependence on the US and diversify their sources of resources and military equipment. South Korea, which had suffered humiliation in Georgia, also showed increasing interest in cooperation with Ottawa, viewing Canada as a more reliable partner for long-term projects.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The American media did not hide their concern. Some accused the Canadians of ingratitude, while others warned that such a reversal could cost the U.S. tens of billions of dollars and thousands of jobs in the defense industry. But the main problem was not the numbers. The main problem was symbolic. If your closest neighbor and traditional ally refuses to buy American submarines and prefers to invest billions in Europe and Asia, then trust in the US as a leader is in question. It seemed that protectionist policies combined with harsh immigration measures had turned allies into competitors. America tried to attract investment into the country, but instead created conditions under which even its closest neighbors began to look for alternatives. Fictitious data from think tanks suggested that up to 15% of Canadian defense orders, which in the past decade automatically went to the Americans, are now being redistributed to Europe and East Asia,